Okay, so thank you to everyone for joining. We're just waiting for more attendees to join us in the room, and we'll get going in the next minute or so. Okay, so to our 3 attendees thus far, we now have a 4th joining. Let's just give it a minute or so just for the platform to allow for more attendees to join. Okay, so given that this is streaming to YouTube as well, where colleagues may be joining, I suggest we move ahead, and as more people join us, either through the Zoom platform or YouTube, they can then tap into the discussion as we move along. So thank you to everyone for joining us wherever you are, but for us it's this afternoon. We've got an hour and a half set aside to present this panel on our newly released report, Access Denied, which looks at failures by the South African government in ensuring that it meets its own targets in relation to implementing internet access in South African schools. So with that said, I just want to introduce the panelists. Looking at my screen, at least, in what we call this new normal, from my left is Nino Garuli, who's a fellow at the Global Human Rights Clinic at the University of Chicago Law School. Then Ryan Hawthorne, who's a director at Acacia Economics based in South Africa. Pakamile Khumalo, who is a public and media skills development manager at Media Monitoring Africa. And then Avani Singh, who is a director and co-founder of Alt Advisory. I'm Michael Power, I'm your moderator, and I'm also a director at Alt Advisory. With that said, you would have seen through registration that there's strict adherence to the CPESA Code of Conduct for FIFA Africa. So as with all other panels, we want to ensure that this is as safe a space as possible. So harassment in any form is not tolerated. And if we can just ensure that we keep, well, possibly having robust discussions, we ensure that no harassment takes place in any form. With that said, we're using both the Wova app, and equally, you can use the chat function if you have any questions for us. So today we launched this report, and we're proud to indicate that it's been launched online as well. So if you have a look at internetaccess.africa, I'm going to post a link in the chat for you. Here you can find the report, which is both available for download, and equally there's an e-reader function for your ease of use. With that said, this has been a 2-year project, and we're proud to have completed it. By way of a bit of context, this whole idea started 4 years ago, and Ryan Hawthorne, who's one of the panelists today, is largely responsible for this research and any advocacy that will flow. But to cut a long story short, Avani and I, at that stage, worked at the Legal Resources Center. And Ryan approached us, pointing out some of the deficiencies that he had identified in internet access and schooling. From that, we continued the discussion. In 2018, the University of Chicago agreed to assist with this research, which then led us down a 2-year project to today, where the research is now complete as a phase 1 of this particular project. And now, based on the strength of this research, we as a research team will consider our next steps going forward. And hopefully that's something we can discuss with all of you today. So then to start with our panels, how we're going to set it up is we're going to give each panelist 10 minutes to present on different sections of the report. And equally, Pakamile from Media Monitoring Africa will give us some anecdotal grassroots experiences of deficiencies in access and take us through Media Monitoring's web ranges process, which is a really fascinating endeavor and something that can be incorporated into other mechanisms across the continent. The other 3 speakers are going to be taking you through the report. That'll take us about the first 45 minutes of the presentation. Thereafter, we'll open up a discussion with members of the panel and participants and really discuss next steps, both in the South African context and equally around the continent. So with that said, Nino, underpinning this report are two fundamental rights. The first is access to education. We then also look at the best interest of the child. But interestingly, we also lean on unfair discrimination. Do you mind taking us through the legal underpinnings of internet access in schools?
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for having us. It's such a pleasure to join, and thank you for coming to hear more about the report. So as Michael mentioned, we're going to be talking about internet access in schools and what it really means for learners to be deprived of access when they're going through, K through 12 education. And the human rights guaranteed, and I'm going to be talking about the human rights guaranteed both by the International Legal Order as well as the South African Constitution, because it really provides us with the legal and the moral standards, a framework through which we can evaluate the current state of internet access. So I'm going to actually share my screen. Here we are with you all. Okay, can everyone see that?
It's coming through well, Nina.
Okay, excellent, excellent. So I want to begin actually with a brief video. So, we all right now are joining this conference through our computers. We all enjoy a solid internet connection. And I suspect most of us for the last number of months have been doing almost everything online, right? And because it has become so ubiquitous for us, the access that we enjoy and how much we do through it, sometimes it can be easy to overlook just how vital it is for almost every aspect of our lives and how much someone is disadvantaged when they lose that connection or don't have it. I've never had it. So I actually want to start with a short video, which comes from a Canadian news report that does, I think, a nice job of setting up what the stakes really are and what it really means to lack access, either because you don't have connectivity at all or because of lack of affordability in a world where everything is done digitally. So.
In the digital economy, Heidi Gatto is stuck in analog, not by choice.
You have to pick, do you want food or do you want internet? Do you want clothes or do you want internet?
Gatto is a single mother with two young, school-aged children. She's unemployed, on social assistance, and without online access, struggling to escape a cycle of poverty.
I need internet to look for work. I need internet to enroll in a school. I need internet to give resumes, to send resumes to jobs. I need internet for my children, my son when he does projects.
Those needs, some suggest, are now universal. Broadband internet service, the argument goes, should be treated like a public utility, much like water or electricity.
It is not a luxury anymore. Maybe 15 years ago was a luxury, but now it's something that is a necessity for everybody.
Anti-poverty activists say telecommunications companies should be forced to offer subsidized access to those in need. Without some sort of change, people like Heidi Gatto will continue to be on the wrong side of the growing digital divide.
Now it's a need. We all need it, or we were lost.
Okay, so that, I think it puts a human face on what it really means to not have access when you need it for every bit of just running your life. And it really drives home the point that we are making with this report, which is that the internet is no longer a luxury, right? In today's world, we need it for most essential parts of our lives. We use it to find information, and this can be, right, anything from an address for a medical office or a hospital or a government service that we need to go to, and how and when to go there, how to make an appointment, to know what materials we need to bring. It is the way we access news and information of what's going on around us, both in our own countries and across the world. We need the internet to find out what jobs are available in our area or somewhere else if you want to move. what qualifications are required and how we may gain those qualifications, right? We needed to prepare a resume to develop the key skills for that resume. We needed to research what universities we might want to go to and what's available for us to learn about the application process, and then what is required for us to succeed once we're at the university. And then we needed to find scholarships or to find other forms of financial aid. And it can be the difference between going or not going to university, between finding or not finding a job, and then the difference between thriving and succeeding in those forums or not. So ultimately, the internet has become an essential component of living a full life in the 21st century. And that is what the human rights system and the South African Constitution have come to and are coming to realize. So as Michael mentioned, there are three key rights at stake. I mean, there are more, but we want to focus on three key rights that really orient our thinking around internet access as a fundamental human right, which is the best interests of the child, the right to basic education, and the freedom from discrimination or equal protection of the laws. Right, and each of these rights are implicated and violated by the existing digital divide that we're going to be talking more about today. There we go. And here's where one of the core principles that we're talking about that is actually embedded in the international human rights system protected by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the South African Constitution, provides us a way to orient our thinking, right? So the South African Constitution guarantees that a child's best interests are of paramount importance in every matter concerning the child. It's a core principle because it forces us and the state, everyone, to identify the main good, the main aim, kind of the main concern, which is our duty to evaluate policies, systems, and institutions through. Is to think about how it impacts the lives of children and to think about the ways in whether those systems and institutions and policies are actually advancing the best interest and protecting the best interests of the child. And when we look at it this way, we begin to understand why internet access in schools and providing our children and youth with the relevant digital literacy skills is so vital, right? Because it is at this stage of their development that access to technology is most important. All of the essential life tasks that we went through on the previous slides will be that much more difficult, if not impossible, if a child never learns how to navigate the digital landscape. And so when we consider the value of internet in schools, we must understand just how vital it is if we are to equip children with the basic tools they need to not only learn what they need to learn in schools, but to be ready to meet the adult world once they leave school. You know, according to statistics, the South African General Household Survey, between 14 and 15 million children in South Africa don't have access to the internet in schools as of 2017. And that is a staggering gap and a staggering loss in which we are not preparing children for what's coming for them. Now, the second right, which is the right to a basic education, right, is when we move to think more specifically about the simple and important idea of preparation and empowerment, right? It's also contained in how the law understands the right to a basic education. It provides the foundations from which so much can spring, and without which it becomes brutally difficult, if not impossible, to really be prepared and to enter the adult world. So the South African Constitution has found the right to a basic education to be a core right because it prepares the child for a responsible life in a free society. That's a quote. In other words, we put emphasis on the right to an education because of how vital it is, not only for preparing students and learners for the labor market, but also because it's essential for forming full citizens capable of understanding and participating in a democracy and in our society. So as the world around us moves online more and more, for education to remain really relevant and helpful, it needs to move online and become more technology-based as well. Now, so as you can imagine, there can be a great deal of debate about what exactly is included in this right to a basic education. So far, the courts in South Africa have held that there are some core requirements that go into the basic right. So here it has been found that having a school and a sufficient number of classrooms is part of that right. as well as transportation so that you can actually get to school and receive the education, right? And having furniture and facilities that can make it possible for a student to receive information, to be in an environment where they can actually learn what's being taught to them, right? So here, as well as textbooks and teachers. So essentially everything that is necessary for a student to be able to receive information and to not be distracted by, a caving roof or a lack of safe sanitation facilities has been found by the courts to be essential. Now, while the internet access has not been added to that list yet, who could argue that internet access has not become an essential component of the right to a basic education? Not only does the internet facilitate delivery of information and lessons and exercises, it makes it easier to tailor learning to students and to promote better learning. And it's also essential for actually teaching students the digital literacy skills. When we conducted the research in the rural parts of Limpopo, we went to visit schools. We spoke with numerous students who told us about assignments that they would be given to conduct research beyond what may have been taught in a classroom or maybe available in their textbook, or to type up a document, prepare a certain kind of document for a class exercise, which they would need to turn in. And many students wouldn't be able to do it because they didn't have access either in school or outside of it. And they would have to rely on one or two students in the class who were lucky enough to have access either at home through their parents, or some other means that they would have to copy the assignment or copy the answers from one of these students. And the national curriculum also, right, requires research-based assignments as part of learning for students. So when a child cannot complete an assignment, a child cannot conduct research to answer basic questions for a class, that child is being denied the basic tools which they need for learning in school. And it's this very reason, right, how essential it has become, that international law and bodies have also come to focus on the right to internet access and have started to articulate the importance of getting access to the internet. So this is from the UN Human Rights Council in a resolution on the promotion and protection of enjoyment of human rights on the internet, where the council said, access to information on the internet facilitates vast opportunities for affordable and inclusive education globally, thereby being an important tool to facilitate the promotion of the right to education, while underlining the need to address digital literacy and the digital divide as it affects the enjoyment of the rights to education. So as this has really become the crux, right? As the internet has become a key tool for realizing human rights on the internet and realizing the right to education, we have also seen this real digital divide between the privileged who can pay for best access and get it from a very young age, and the disadvantaged who lack any meaningful access well into high school and beyond. And that inequality falls on all too familiar lines in most societies, and in South Africa, in familiar lines that have been cemented by the apartheid legacy. And here, this is the third and final and really one of the key human rights that is at stake in the current state of connectivity, which is the right to freedom from discrimination, right? As access is essential not only for education, but for equal protection, which is a bedrock principle of the international human rights order. It's really what the entire system is built on. And it's also a core right protected by the South African Constitution and statutory law. So, South African law prohibits any law or policy or act that, sorry about that, losing that there, right? So that causes or perpetuates systemic disadvantage or adversely affects the equal enjoyment of a person's rights and freedoms. And this is the same principle that has been picked up by the UN Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly that have recognized the discriminatory impact of the digital divide and have called on states to bridge the divide and ensure real and affordable access to everyone. Because inequality in education is one of the most harmful realities, one that has an impact for decades on to students, but also generations for a country. And the learners in the rural and under-resourced communities who already lack materials, who already lack textbooks and teachers, are the same ones who lack internet access and technology. And access to these technologies has the potential to close the gap and the inequalities that exist beyond the internet and bring resources to communities that have been starved for decades. So I will actually end it there and hand it over to Avani.
So Nina, thank you so much. If I can just briefly jump in.
Yeah.
And just on that, sort of the fundamental human rights underpinning, I think in moving on to Avani, Avani, the South African government accepts that there is a legal obligation. In doing so, we make the finding in the report that the government has in many ways failed to meet connectivity targets that it itself set. So do you mind taking us through where we locate those targets, what those targets are, and what the effective barriers to implementation and effective access have been, and what we've identified through our particular research?
Thanks, Michael. And thank you so much to CPESA and Paradigm Initiative for providing this platform for us to launch the report today, which we're really excited about. So just to take you then to some of the barriers that we identified in the report. And maybe just to say that when we did the research and when we started this process, I think I had certain perceptions about what I thought the barriers were and what some of the key challenges would be. And I think that also shifted the more that we discussed these different topics with the learners, the teachers, the educators on the ground who are facing this on a day-to-day basis. And probably the two key learnings for me were trying to understand what we mean by meaningful access to the internet. So realizing that it's more than just access to a computer. It's about a more holistic approach to internet access in schools that's sustainable and on a continued basis. And then I think the second really key realization for me was that the challenges and the barriers, which are significant and do present hurdles to access, aren't insurmountable. I think a lot of these things can be achieved, and a lot of work is being done, unfortunately, in quite a staggered and inconsistent way, but that there are solutions that can be readily achieved to overcoming these challenges. And I think what we realized is that there's an apparent need for ongoing maintenance, support, affordability, but also to assist teachers to understand how to, if access is facilitated, how to integrate internet access into the classroom in a meaningful and effective way so that learners can achieve the best outcomes from these different mediums that are presented. So these are, just as an overview, some of the challenges and the barriers that we identified in the report. And you'll see as I go through the discussion that these are quite interlinked. So many of them feed into each other. And Ryan will talk a little bit more in the next session about the affordability of access and the infrastructure provision. But at a more kind of overview level, this is kind of the key challenges that we noticed that came up repeatedly in our discussions. So maybe to start with then, I'd like to draw your attention to a key policy that was published in South Africa in 2013, which was South Africa Connect. And that published quite ambitious targets for access to the internet in South Africa. And when we talk about issues around the variable progress in terms of meeting policy achievements, in terms of coordination and implementation, I think this is for me, one of the most obvious and urgent barriers that needs to be addressed, because this affects all schools across the board and impacts all learners in terms of their achievement and ability to access the internet. So in terms of South Africa Connect, which, as I mentioned, was published in 2013, the aim was that all schools would be connected at a rate of 1 gigabytes per second by 2030. And that borrows its targets from the National Development Plan. And South Africa Connect emphasized and recognized very clearly the importance of access to the internet in achieving all fundamental rights in South Africa, including the rights to education, access to information, freedom of expression, equality, dignity, and so on. but it's had quite a staggered and checkered past in terms of its implementation. And whilst the targets have been revised, even with those revised targets, by the end of 2018, the Department of Telecommunications, or the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies as it is now, recognized that South Africa was probably about 4 to 5 years behind its implementation plan regarding these targets. And the achievement of 100% of schools being connected by 2030 has probably been pushed out quite significantly in terms of whether or not that's going to be achievable. The parliamentary committee that oversees the implementation of SA Connect has severely criticized the department for its very slow implementation and problematic approach to this policy, raising concerns that perhaps the department was not taking this seriously enough, had not properly catered for budgetary cuts, and had in some instances to return funds to Treasury because the funding hadn't been spent appropriately. So there were a number of issues around tenders and procurement and so on, which caused delays to the detriment of learners who would otherwise have had the opportunity to benefit from access to the internet. SA Connect is probably one of the key policies that sets out the achievement of an aim towards universal access to the internet in South Africa. But I also want to flag for your attention something that's known as the Universal Service and Access Obligations, which pertain to the individual network operators in South Africa. And so in order for them to get their licenses, different operators have to connect a certain number of schools in order to both receive and then retain their license. But this brings me to the point around coordination and implementation. One of the frequent concerns we heard was that there was a lack of information or meaningful information about which schools had connectivity and the extent to which the schools were prepared for such connectivity. So through their infrastructure, electricity, and so on. So for example, what we learned from our interviews was that some schools that were already connected were being earmarked for future connections again. Some schools that were neighboring each other would have one school connected, whilst the other was not, even though it would be quite a simple process to do so. And what we see is that with different departments, different regulators, and different role players participating in a number of different initiatives, there is a lack of coordination or overarching framework that causes these different stakeholders to speak to each other. And this has resulted in, one, significant delays, two, and two, a lack of sustainability in the internet access that's being provided. Again, one of the key learnings that we gathered from our research was that the Department of Basic Education is a key stakeholder in achieving internet access in schools. But one of the problems is that in performing this quite significant role, the Department of Basic Education was not capacitated or given resources to perform this coordinating or consolidating role that it's being asked to play. So for example, the department was not able to provide lists of schools that did and didn't have access to the internet. It couldn't inform the operators or other stakeholders about which schools had infrastructure. And in some cases, schools weren't being informed when they had been earmarked for access to the internet and would just have people pitching up on the day to install internet access without any prior knowledge of this. So the lack of coordination and implementation, I think, is one of the barriers that urgently needs to be addressed. And what that requires, in my view, is a revisiting of our targets that are more realistic and updated in line with what's being expected of the state and the private sector. And then a very key designation of who holds responsibility so that there can be no excuses for a lack of oversight or implementation. This brings me on to the second kind of category of barriers which we identified, which was the lack of infrastructure and facilities in some of the schools. And Nina's already mentioned that South Africa's apartheid history speaks to a backlog in infrastructure. And many schools, as we currently stand, lack very basic resources that are needed to provide access to education. So for some of the people we spoke to, internet access seemed like a luxury or a priority that was just, or was not a priority that could trump, for example, things like fixing roofs, making sure that there were no leaks in the schools, having proper access to bathrooms and classrooms. Learners told us about having to drag their chairs from classroom to classroom because they didn't have facilities. And so what we noticed was a very stark disparity between those schools that were better resourced, which had, for example, smart classrooms and smart boards that were sponsored by Google, had very well-equipped internet labs with server rooms and so on, versus other schools, where even the principals or the secretaries in the schools would have one computer that was used solely for the purpose of uploading marks, where they would buy data bundles for that very specific purpose, but there was no broader access being made available. Security was a key consideration in terms of the infrastructure and facilities that kept coming up. Schools largely, from what we understand, are responsible for their own security and insurance. And where there is theft, for example, no replacements are provided. And so in one of the schools that we spoke to, the reality was that the computers that were provided were locked in storerooms, only made accessible to teachers on a very limited basis. And the learners did not have the benefit of it. The second sort of really key infrastructure hurdle that we identified was around electricity. So whilst the Department of Basic Education has identified approximately 269 schools in South Africa that have no electricity, no access to electricity, the reality is that for the other schools, there remains inconsistent electricity. And whilst this is insufficient to maintain even 1 or 2 computers, it is particularly insufficient if you want to establish a full computer room that requires a server lab, air conditioning, and other resources to maintain consistent access. So for many teachers, they were relying on personal computers, but similarly, many teachers did not have their own computers or didn't know how to use it. And so it was a very inconsistent picture that was painted in terms of internet access based on the facilities available. Aside from the support that schools get from the state or from the private sector, the schools themselves in their own budget just lacked private funds to be able to source the equipment themselves. Data costs, although subsidized, remain prohibitively high in South Africa. And it was, for many schools that we spoke to, the reality was that they would be buying small bundles on a kind of quite staggered basis just for their immediate needs. Security and insurance, as I've already mentioned, were just not feasible for the schools to provide for themselves. And so in the absence of that being catered for by the department or through the Universal Service and Access Funds, it just wasn't possible for the schools to fund it themselves. And that to some extent has led to an over-reliance, I think, by schools on NGOs and corporate social responsibility, which has had phenomenally positive effects and has had really good outcomes. But at the same time, I think has meant that we've had quite a staggered and unsustainable progress towards meaningful and universal access for the schools on a consistent basis. And we've seen that some schools are being prioritized over others, which again leads to this underlying inequality in terms of internet access. And then the last category that I want to mention is just around the issue of training and IT support to schools. So as many of the teachers identified to us, they were born before technology. They didn't grow up using laptops and smartphones. And so for them, integrating technology into the classroom was not really something that was considered as a key concern because they lacked the skills to be able to do so. Another challenge that was identified is that where schools did have certain limited number of computers, they weren't identified or dedicated IT support persons who could help them if something went wrong, if there were technical issues or infrastructure issues. And so the challenge was that if something broke, there would be no replacement, and that would just be the end of it. Whilst there are some really interesting programs that are being run to educate and upskill teachers, this remains quite a voluntary process for teachers who are interested in it and who want to engage in it. But there's no concerted drive to really push teachers to upskill themselves, to support them in that upskilling, and to enable them to integrate technology into their classrooms and their curriculum. And what that leads to, lastly, I think, is some of the misconceptions that we identified around access to the internet. In many schools, learners weren't only accessed the internet through smartphones that had been given to them by parents, or which they borrowed from siblings or other relatives, and weren't allowed to use it in schools because it was seen as a tool for gossip, to share, to use social media, but not really recognized for its value or its benefit in uplifting the learner, enhancing learner achievement, and I think in achieving personal development and autonomy around different issues that might be of key concern. And so when we talk about changing the mindset around recognizing internet access as a fundamental right, as a primary priority in terms of the right to education, I think breaking down these barriers around the misconceptions as well in terms of what the internet is used for and the beneficial potential that it has is one of the key challenges that we'll also need to overcome going forward to ensure that there's universal access. The report then concludes with a number of recommendations around how we can achieve or overcome these barriers and achieve universal access in schools. But Michael, if I'm not mistaken, we'll come back to that at the end of the discussion.
Hi, Arvin. Yes, I think that's preferable. If you don't mind holding off and we can just sort of close the loop on that a bit later. And thank you so much for comprehensively taking us through the barriers. Maybe then there's a useful segue towards your presentation, Pakamile, and really to highlight, and I don't think this is overstated, but the absolutely fantastic work that Media Monitoring Africa does on a daily basis. Yes. Particularly your Web Ranges project. And, Arvini left it off in saying that there's some work for us to do. You and the team at MMA have now for quite a considerable amount of time been doing that work already. And Definitely. Would you tell us what the civil society response looks like and what more can be done?
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, colleagues, for this great opportunity to be able to share with you a bit about Web Ranges and the amazing work we do. Colleagues have already stated a bit about the kind of challenges that our young people and our learners in schools are facing around access to the internet. And so my section is really going to be highlighting some of the things that are reflected in the report, but also some of the experiences from Web Ranges and also some of the voices that come out through codes that really reflect how they feel and how it impacts them, the idea of lack of access to the internet and how it affects them in their schooling environment and even through the program. So just a bit about Web Ranges. So the program is an international digital and media literacy program that is designed to empower young people with critical skills so they can engage with media and the internet in a responsible and safe manner, and then also champion their rights into the digital world and encourage other learners and their peers to do the same. We started this process in 2016, and it's really it has moved on from just being a program around online safety to being really a movement of young people who understand how to use the internet safely and responsibly, and then also encourage their peers to do the same. So it's really a peer-to-peer led initiative that is led by Media Monitoring Africa together with partners that are on the presentation screen. We really had the idea of really wanting to empower young people to be in the forefront of their own growth in terms of the digital space and being able to lead the way and pave the way how they want to see the digital space and how they want to present themselves online. And so the young people that form part of the program are able to create innovative campaigns that empower their peers with skills and information. They're able to become online safety ambassadors that promote active digital citizenry within the communities through the innovative campaigns that they create, but also through face-to-face interactions and presenting in schools and making sure that they spread the word around online safety to other young people that are not fortunate enough to be part of the program. And lastly, which is also really a big highlight for us at Web Ranges, the ability to engage in high-level ICT-related policy discussions and submissions, which is through our Article 12 group. So this group is really specifically focused on policy, ICT policy submissions and engagements, and really having our young people be able to engage in high-level policy and discussions has really really created an environment where young people feel empowered to give their opinions and their ideas and to kind of be involved in solving the issues that we face as a country and making our country a better place and making the online space a better place. And so that's really our Web Rangers program. So the issue of access for our web ranges, so feedback and results that have been gathered from the report that is being presented today reflect a lot of the challenges and issues that web ranges have experienced. And really, collectively as MMA and web ranges, there is really a need and a call for a need for implementation of the universal internet access in South African schools in order to achieve equal access. And that we can't say enough. And I think through the quotes and through this brief discussion, you'll understand why there's really a need for this kind of implementation. So for web ranges, access has several components. The first one is the role of schools in ensuring access to the internet. The second one is around integration of digital literacy skills into schooling curriculum. And the third one is around access to low and affordable data for school connection. So the role of schools in ensuring access to the internet, and Navani has also mentioned this. If we want to prepare our learners for the fourth industrial revolution, which is already here, we need a widespread restructuring of the physical infrastructure that Navani has already spoken about to be able to meet this, the needs that the new revolution is bringing. We also need a shift away from traditional modes of teaching and learning towards a system that equips learners with critical skills and competencies. So a different understanding of what education is in the digital world, or what schooling is. How do young people relate to content? How do young people interact with content, whether it's online or through a discussion or through a webinar? How does that happen so that we are able to empower them to take up a leading role in this new revolution? And then lastly, it's about the implementation of internet access in schools through the introduction of computer labs, tablets, and other devices for connection. And this is also now speaking to the actual physical access of devices that enable connectivity. I remember when we started in 2016, we didn't have any schools that had specifically been funded for computer labs and tablets, and we found that a lot of the young people had challenges in carrying out their web range activities in the school setup because they were not supported, and schools just didn't have capacity and resources to be able to support them. And then in 2017, we had a partnership with MTN through the MTN SA Foundation project to implement in those schools that have been equipped and resourced with computer labs. And there was a huge difference in those schools because they were able to get access to the computer labs. They were able to get access to tablets and devices to be able to do the web ranger training. But more than that, they were able to get into the internet and explore as young people and start to really realize what it is that they need to do to become active digital citizens. And that is really important. So Matsiriso, one of our 2019 web rangers, had this to say about the lack of access to devices in her school. And she goes to a school in Soweto. And she says, open quote, lack of access to devices such as laptops at my school has really made it hard for us to do schoolwork that requires thorough research and concentration, since it's hard to study at home using our phones, which sometimes don't have data. At my school, Wi-Fi is only used for teaching and not learning, and for not learning purposes. So only teachers can use it and not learners. It is really disturbing because some kids who don't come from well-off families struggle to get access to data at home, so they end up using Wi-Fi hotspots such as malls, since they don't have access to Wi-Fi at their own homes. We end up submitting assignments late and projects late. So that, close quote, sorry. So that really kind of amplifies the need for our schools to have to be supported with infrastructure and devices, so that our young people have a holistic kind of environment where they can be able to interact and have access to the internet. We have also 2019 Web Ranger says, and this is now during the COVID period. He says, open quote, my school tried giving us extra lessons via social media, thinking it will make things easier since most of us were not going to school due to COVID-19. But it somehow made things a little bit more complicated because more than 50% of learners don't have access to devices and data, and our school also doesn't have labs for us. So again, amplifying the need for our young people to have these devices in the school setup in order for them to have a conducive environment for their learning. The second point is around integration of digital literacy skills to schooling curriculum. This has been really a priority at MMA and Web Ranges for us. And we've been really pushing it in the last 2 years to be able to get digital literacy curricula into the schooling curricula, particularly looking at the life orientation subject. So the inclusion of digital literacy skills into schooling curriculum aids the kind of movement from online to online learning, and teaching as a critical element to realizing universal access. And so William, our director at MMA, always says that if you give a child a tablet, it's like giving a child a car without them having a license. So that child will never be able to drive, and likelihood of them having an accident is almost 100%, because they don't have the necessary skills to navigate. And this is so true for our young people when it comes to digital literacy skills. So as much as we talk about access to actual devices and infrastructure, very important to also talk about digital literacy skills that should accompany the actual access to devices. So another point is that it provides a holistic understanding of technology and how our learners can integrate it into their everyday lives. So they're able to take advantage of the new opportunities that technology has to offer. And this is really helping our young people understand that the internet it has both negative and positive, but how do you use the positive to your advantage while also understanding that there are negatives and being aware of those negatives. But further to that, being able to then become an active digital citizen. How does that process work? What do you need to do? And that's really about digital literacy skills and gaining those important skills to be able to lead the revolution, to lead into the digital world and be a leading player in the digital world. So this enables learners to be highly skilled people who can be able to use, build, and work alongside innovative technology in their everyday lives. And this is where we want to get to. We want to get to the point where learners are highly skilled individuals who are able to work alongside technology to advance in their everyday lives. And we have another quote by Joy from also a 29 Web Ranges program saying that, open quote, Web Ranges is great, but it can only do so much. I still see a lot of my friends making careless mistakes that will affect them deeply in the future, posting things that will affect their digital footprint negatively. We need these skills to be taught in the classroom for us all. And this is really, like I said, we've really been pushing to get digital literacy curricula into schooling curricula to be able to impact more young people and to turn it into not just an extracurricular or an extra activity that young people engage in, but have them understand that it's part of being in the digital world. It's part of this new normal of being online and being an active digital citizen. And this sentiment is also echoed by our Deputy Minister, Ms. Piki Kikana, during our 2020 Web Ranges launch, when she said, open quote, "My last challenge for this coming year is in addressing the closing of the digital divide and impacting as many children as possible." And so we do have, close quote, so we do have support from government. It's just about how do we start the process and how do we work together with government, businesses, and civil society institutions to work together to ensure that we move this forward and we enable more young people to be able to get digital literacy skills to pave the way for their digital footprint and the digital world. The last one is around access to low and affordable data for school connection. Avani mentioned this point. So a substantial number of schools in urban areas, even in rural areas, do have I don't want to say it's minimal compared to what it should be. They do have support with infrastructure such as computer labs, but they remain unconnected due to high data costs that schools can't afford. And so there's really a call for the Access Fund to do more to ensure the schools remain connected. A lot of the schools that Web Rangers are in, when you visit those schools, you find that they have these really beautiful computer labs that are funded by private organizations. but they're closed and there are no teachers that can be able to operate them. There are no data support systems that can be able to ensure that those labs are open and learners are making most of it. So even when there are opportunities for funding for actual labs and infrastructure, data cost is something that we also need to consider and moving forward in ensuring equal access. We have Joy, who also says that due to Joy, who has a quote that says, open quote, due to COVID-19, we can't go to school every day, meaning some lessons are online. But because a lot of students don't have access to Wi-Fi or sufficient data, they miss the lesson. Some of these lessons are vital to them to the passing. I think she meant to them passing. And I think, close quote, I think also, again, highlighting the issue of not being able to get a connection, not being able to afford data for connection. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really shown how previously disadvantaged schools really are not supported or don't have enough infrastructure and devices and resources to be able to support learners and continue with schooling as before the pandemic. And so more needs to be done, obviously, on this issue. I want to end off this presentation with a testimony by Joy Fagute, who's one of the web rangers from 2019. She was fortunate enough to attend the Internet Governance Forum 2019 in Berlin, Germany. And she says that, open quote, going to Germany boosted my confidence and helped me realize that I can truly do anything I put my mind to. The experience has taught me two things. There's so much more outside of home. Don't be afraid to go exploring. Number two, you know you can do it. So believe in yourself enough to stand up for what you think is right, even when people don't have a clear vision of your plan yet. We were just two teenagers given the opportunity to address issues of child online safety at a global stage, and we came up with some pretty good solutions that adults need to think about. Imagine if other children around the world were given a platform to voice out their ideas and opinions. How many more problems could be solved? And so she was fortunate enough, like I said, to begin with an opportunity to go to Germany to attend the Internet Governance Forum last year, and she was really an amazing young lady who was able to have high-level discussions with on a global scale, like she says, with adults in the room, and be able to equally give her opinion and equally give her thoughts about how do we solve issues of online safety, how do we solve issues of child online safety, and ensure that more young people are safe online. And so this is the picture that we want all our children to experience, all our learners in school to experience. We want them to have confidence. We want them to not only just think about the internet as social media or Instagram or Facebook, but we want them to understand the opportunities that lie in the internet when used responsibly, and how they can advance. How can the internet advance the many opportunities that they have? And so, really, this is the picture of the learners that we want to have going forward. And I think working together, we can definitely working together with government and business and civil society, we can definitely start thinking about how do we make this picture an everyday picture for every single child that is in our schools, and to allow them that opportunity to be able to just go, and don't be afraid to go exploring. Don't be afraid to be on the internet. Don't be afraid to use the internet to advance your opportunities, but also to not just think about yourself, but think about other people. How do you make the world a better place for other people? How do you make your country a better place for other people using the internet, using what is available online? And so we want to get our learners to this point. I think I'll end it off there. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, I'm sure Michael will open the floor for more questions around the Web Rangers program and the work we do. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pakamila, and thank you for taking us through all of the wonderful work that you and the team at Media Monitoring Africa are doing. For the benefit of participants, I've posted in the chat both a link to Media Monitoring Africa's expansive list of online tools, and equally a direct link to the Web Rangers program for your further reference.
Thank you so much.
Of course, following on from what Pakamile indicated, please feel free to post any questions that you have either in the chat function you can mark it to all panelists. Alternatively, we're also monitoring the Wova app, where you're welcome to post any questions that you may have. With that said, and speaking quite frankly, this is the first report I've worked on directly with economists. And what I really enjoyed through this research project was how we all wanted to ultimately solve a particular question, but approached it in such fantastically different ways. So for those who have just joined the call, you'll note that I've posted a copy of our report in the chat function. And if I can just take you then to page 34 onwards. Ryan, I'm going to hand over to you and really to ask you to address the economic viability of internet access in schools. That's the lens through which you've approached this particular research. And yeah, we would love to learn from you and hear a bit more. We understand from a legal position what is required. We've heard from Pakamile socially what's being done by civil society organizations. What is the economic position?
Great, thanks, Michael. And if I can just share my screen with you, I will try and answer some of those questions in the next couple of minutes, very briefly. So the first thing to try and think about is, what is the actual gap at the moment? I mean, how bad are things? And I sometimes think that this question gets missed, particularly when you see a lot of announcements by the government and all sorts of resources being devoted to the fourth industrial revolution, and all sorts of exciting things are planned and are happening. But I think it's sometimes good to just have a look at where things are currently in South Africa, just so that we have a very real impression of where the gaps are and what the problems are. So the first point to note, and Nino has already mentioned this, that between 14 and 15 million learners report that they don't have access to the internet at school. So that's from Statistics South Africa's General Household Survey. So that's actually their 2018 GHS, which was published last year. And essentially that means that more than 90% of learners do not have internet access at school. But not only do very, very few learners have internet access to the school, but there's a massive urban and rural digital divide, racial divide, and which I think Nino and Avni mentioned is a big problem, of course, in South Africa with our history of apartheid. So for instance, if you start at the top right panel here, you can see that these green bars show internet in schools reported by Stats SA, and you can see that in provinces like the Western Cape and Gauteng, internet access in schools is significantly higher, at about 16% or 19%, compared to way down in Mpumalanga and Limpopo, where actually about 2% of learners have access to the internet at school. So that's almost a tenfold discrepancy there between Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and the Western Cape and Gauteng in respect of internet access in schools. And remember that these kids don't have internet access at home either. So we've put both sets of statistics on this particular graph, and in orange you can see internet access at home. And again, you can see this enormous digital divide, where in the Western Cape and Gauteng, about 20% of learners have internet access at home, and only about, whereas in the Western Cape and Gauteng, whereas in Mpumalanga and Limpopo, sort of around 1% in Limpopo of learners have internet access at home. So there's a horrifying digital divide there. And if you look at the second figure, you can see this as well. There's this divide between cities, between metro areas and non-metro areas. So at the top, you can see a whole lot of non-metro areas where, again, internet access at home and at schools is far less than is available to less than 5% of learners, compared to in the cities, where closer to up to about 25% of learners, actually, depending on the city, have access to internet at home or internet at schools. So there's not only this enormous gap overall, 90% don't have access, but there's also this incredible digital divide between rural and urban. But even if you don't believe the General Household Survey, which surveys about 20,000 households every year, you can have a look at the Department of Basic Education's National Education Infrastructure Management System. And there what you can see is that the Department of Basic Education reports that 80% of schools do not have internet connectivity for teaching and learning. 80% of schools do not have internet connectivity for teaching and learning. So out of our 23,000 odd schools in South Africa, about 4,500 have internet access. And so there's an enormous gap that needs to be filled. And I think this is an important place to start. And you might have a question in the back of your mind, but you know, what is all of this for, and does it really matter? Why do we need internet access at schools? And of course, Pakamile took you through a whole lot of examples of why kids actually need this. But you can also look to very rigorous, very high quality economic research recently published in the American Economic Review, which shows how computer-aided learning can result in significantly improved test results for language and mathematics. And this is partly because it enables teaching at the right level. And this is a big problem in developing countries, where in fact it's curriculum and pedagogy aren't actually targeted at learners. And whereas what computer-aided learning does is it allows for dynamic, user-based or individual level learning. And so this is what these researchers found had a very big difference, made a very big impact, positive impact. And then second of all, a second big thing that is important to think about in South Africa is the enormous gaps in teacher quality. And these computer-aided learning tools can enable teachers to increase their productivity significantly. And this is important because in South Africa, you know, there's again very well-published research here that's shown how teachers currently employed in low-performing schools score worse on mathematics tests than learners in top-performing schools. So again, this massive gap in educational quality, and something that internet in schools can help to bridge. Okay, and so then the next question that we sort of tried to look at is to say, well, okay, but how realistic is it? I mean, at 23,000 schools, 4,500 have internet. How much money is all of this going to cost, and is it feasible in South Africa? And so what we did was we overlaid what you can see on these maps for the provinces of Gauteng and Limpopo. Is we overlaid maps from many possibilities, maps of our fiber infrastructure in South Africa, with the locations of schools reported by the Department of Education. And what you can actually see in both maps, so not just in the much more urban setting of Gauteng, but also in the more rural setting of Limpopo, is that actually schools are located very close to fiber infrastructure, which is used to deliver internet access in very high volumes, the kinds of volumes that are needed to meet the SA Connect targets that Arvani spoke about. And the point being that, of course, that the operators have rolled out infrastructure to all of these areas to a large degree, actually, to deliver fiber connectivity to their mobile network infrastructure. So because of the fact that mobile network infrastructure requires very high capacity fiber backhaul, in fact, what we see is fiber being reticulated all over the show, particularly in areas that have schools, as can be seen on these two figures. And you don't have to even believe these two maps to believe that internet access is feasible at the SA Connect speeds across South Africa. But in fact, two of our provinces are actually currently implementing this. So the Western Cape, which has 45% of schools in the Western Cape are actually in rural areas. They've implemented almost 90% of their schools now have internet access, and the Eastern Cape is replicating exactly the Western Cape's approach, again, in order to meet these SA Connect targets. So not only is it technically and economically feasible to roll out internet access across the country to all of our schools, but also it's actually being done. And so the question really remains as to why on earth it is that the government isn't taking this more seriously. Okay. And so just in summary, just three main points to take away is that, you know, there's very little internet access in schools in South Africa. 80% of schools just don't have it. Don't have a room in which learners can access the internet, for instance. And economic evidence suggests that computer-aided learning can have a significant, it can significantly improve educational outcomes and improve teacher productivity. And fiber-based access, lastly, is widely available in South Africa, and it is economically feasible to be able to roll it out. And those were the three main points. So back to you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And I think it's safe to say that, you know, those statistics are relatively catastrophic when it comes to what is possible and what the current status quo is. And, you know, with that said, and for the benefit of attendees, we've got about 20 minutes left. We want to open this up into a conversation. And, you know, on the one hand, we've seen that there's a legal requirement. On the other hand, we suggest in our findings that this is economically feasible. And maybe then to start with you, Avani, and, you know, looking at some of the recommendations we make, if the law joins us to ensure access, or at least we argue that it should, and economically it is feasible, what are the remedies available here, and how do we ensure that this goes forward? Is advocating and requesting the state to meet their own stated policy objectives enough?
So I think that's really where our thinking around this report started, was to understand what the gap was, how significant the problem actually, the significance of the problem, and then to understand what our next steps in taking this forward could potentially be. I think advocacy is a really important starting point. I think that in terms of buy-in from the state and the private sector, a lot of people acknowledge that there is a need for universal access in schools. And so I think having these kinds of coordinated conversations, bringing together the different stakeholders, getting them to speak to each other in a more effective manner, I think is a really important starting point. But perhaps it's not enough. And I think there is a possibility that at some stage, this will result in litigation in the same way that we've seen with other forms. Nino took you through the different types of litigation that we've seen around the right of access to education, and how different civil society and schools and different sectors of the population have had to come together to really fight for really fundamental tenets of the right of basic education. And so there's always a possibility that that's where it ends up. But I think starting with advocacy, an urgent need for policy reform to make the commitments much clearer and much more attenuated is the starting point, and then to examine what the next steps going forward might be.
Perfect, thank you, Avani. And just to point out too, for the benefit of attendees, we, as a result of COVID-19, have added a preface to this report, which in fairness documents some of the steps that have been taken to provide access during South Africa's sort of, you know, lockdowns. We had a hard lockdown, and that has kind of gradually eased out. But there have been some measures taken in partnership with the private sector, particularly around zero rating access to certain platforms. But notwithstanding this development, you know, hopefully we can build on from this. We still have this concern about sort of fiber and access at school themselves, which has not been remedied at this stage. So Ryan, maybe moving then to you, what do you see as viable solutions here, and what remedies are in place that we can actually ensure that we start moving towards closing the digital divide?
Well, I mean, in theory, at least, there's the SA Connect project, which falls under the Department of Communications and Digital Technology, and in theory, the government sort of is currently carrying out a feasibility to sort of implement it in the National Treasury, and that's falling under the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and hopefully they'll make progress on this, and hopefully they'll kind of start to roll it out. But I'm just concerned about the fact that it's taken I mean, SA Connect was published in 2013, as you've said earlier. You know, we've missed the 2020 targets quite clearly, dramatically, actually, and it's just not clear to me how the development bank carrying out a feasibility study for something that's obvious and has to be done irrespective. And I mean, makes any sense at this point. I mean, the government ought to be connecting schools. It's as simple as that. So I'm a little bit skeptical about the pace at which and the seriousness with which the government is allocating resources to this. And I'm concerned about the way that the government constantly makes announcements about and clearly seems to be devoting a lot of resources to the fourth industrial revolution and spending lots of money with economists and so on and so forth to try and figure out what all of this means, when in fact we should start with the simple, with the basics, and you know, and provide connectivity at schools.
Thank you, Ryan. Pakamile, notwithstanding the fantastic work that you and Media Monitoring Africa are doing, but what advice do you have to activists, concerned citizens, people who actually want to get involved? What can be done to support your initiatives and others to ensure access in schools?
Thank you so much, Michael. I think moving from here, WebRange is turning 5 this year. And I think our biggest thing, like I said earlier on, our biggest initiative and push is to get digital literacy curricula in schools. That is our biggest push. And if we can do that, then we would have won half the battle. And so whoever is out there listening who wants to support WebRanges, let us work together to push DBE to ensure that digital literacy skills are in every single classroom, or at least in the LO subject in every single school in the country. Last year, we worked together with Google to implement a pilot that was in Cape Town. And as of this year, I think partly 2022 going to 2021, every single LO subject is going to have a section that covers digital literacy. And if it's done in the Western Cape as proven that it can, we can definitely do it in all other 8 provinces. So let us push to get digital literacy curricula into our schooling curriculum. That would be the really huge milestone for DBE.
Perfect. Thank you, Pakamile. And then lastly, there was a question on the WERB application from the Honorable Haj Abdul Samad Saeed. And Nino, I'll pass this on to you, but it's a broader question, but one that is certainly on the minds, I'm sure, of a lot of participants at FIFA Africa, and one that, in my view, is not yet finalized in international law, but I would love to hear your perspectives on it. And it's more broadly this question about whether internet access yet constitutes a human right in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Michael, well, thank you for the question from the audience. And I mean, you've hit it on the nose there, right? So it's not yet it's not yet access itself and independently a human right. But there's a few things to point out, right? So from the Human Rights Council to various bodies, there's been so much in the last 10 or so years on how important protecting human rights on the internet is, right? So how intertwined as more of our lives are now lived online, and how ubiquitous the internet has become for us doing anything, right? From sharing our own views to accessing information and accessing news or what have you, how important it becomes to not think of human rights as something that happens offline, but that really needs to be protected online as well, right? So there is quite a lot already on the fact that for example, protection of the freedom of expression or access to information, which are distinct rights, right, already protected under the ICCPR, and distinctly when we're talking about children by the CRC as well, that they're also protected online, right? So those kinds of elements of it are already being more clearly defined and protected by the international system. But then the other thing to think about, and what our report really talks about, which is that the internet then is also a great enabler other rights, right? So, and when we're talking about the right to education in this context, right, it is an enabler and is becoming, or already is, kind of an essential part of getting a basic education. Now, there isn't yet a holding like that at the international level, but we are definitely moving in that direction, and we have had almost, so many of the treaty bodies and the Human Rights Council itself recognize that we need to be thinking about the protection of these rights on the internet, and to really and the protection of these rights, right? And so, and one other thing to say is that where the international system maybe has been more clear is on, for example, requiring that governments not get in the way, right? So you can think about the way the international system both thinks about positive and negative responsibilities of states. And so that the states can't interfere with people's access to the internet. And here we're talking about shutting down, shutting down access to various either apps or what have you in particular contexts. But then the responsibility to enable is now being articulated. And here also the freedom from discrimination, and which is why we made it one of the key international principles to think through this entire problem with, is because that, I don't know how you can make the argument that there isn't unequal access to a very basic right now, right? That when you need access to the internet as a key part of understanding what the world around you is, as a way of fulfilling what you need to do at school, right? I don't know how you can make the argument really that students have equal access to the internet, and that inequality isn't harming students who lack that access.
Nino, thank you so much. Albany, if I can then move back to you in closing. So you had brought up a slide just detailing some of the final recommendations that we make in the report. I appreciate for attendees, it's been a long day at FIFA Africa, and I'm mindful that we may be in a position to finish slightly earlier. But Albany, do you mind just for the next 5 minutes or so, just taking us in broad strokes through the recommendations we ultimately make based on our research?
Yeah, sure. So I think that the recommendation section is divided into a number of key considerations that we identified throughout the report. And some of the things that we looked at touched very specifically on the barriers that were identified, on meeting the policy commitments, and on the economic side of it. And I think in trying to remedy any rights violations that come as a result of the unequal access, I think these recommendations really speak to wanting to call on all stakeholders to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights in the Constitution and under international law. So one of the, and this has kind of come up repeatedly throughout the presentation, has been around coordination. So trying to achieve better coordination in the policies, in the implementation, housing the requirements for meeting this within the same departments, ensuring that there is strategic communications that are filtered through in a very direct and consistent manner, and drawing in expertise from different stakeholders, from research institutes, from academia, from civil society, in meeting these coordination challenges. The second really speaks to the issue of sustainability and ensuring sustainability of access. And here the report calls on the different stakeholders to pay greater attention to the physical functionality and the infrastructure that schools need to make effective use of technology. And as Phakamile has highlighted already, we've really emphasized throughout the report the importance of training on ICTs for teachers, for school, for parents, for learners at all the different levels, so that people have the critical media and information literacy skills that are needed to be able to use the internet, both for basic connectivity and for basic research, but also to be able to distill credible information and to really self-actualize through the use of the internet. We call on the processes regarding connectivity to be transparent, so that there's clear decision-making that takes place and clear information communicated to the public. And really, one of the key recommendations, I think, has been around calling on more of a focus on using electronic content and technology within the school curriculum, both, as Pakamila has pointed out, to build it early on into the school curriculum, but also, I think, more broadly, to use it for the benefit, as Ryan pointed out, for the benefit of teaching and learning. Then we look more broadly beyond just the schools and how internet access in schools can be beneficial to communities as a whole. So what we saw in some areas, in some schools that were connected, was that the school became a community hotspot that could be used effectively by other community members. And we make a number of recommendations regarding how those hotspots could be effectively rolled out so that other persons, for example, job seekers, people, entrepreneurs, people in communities who lack access to the internet but need it for the very basic realization of different rights and activities on a daily basis, can do so in an effective way. And of course, there's a number of security concerns that come with this. And so the report also considers the different ways in which hotspots can still be protected through firewall, through security, so that learners remain protected. Communities. We also looked at the obligations on operators and the fact that we're not really seeing that many new universal service and access obligations being imposed, and the possibilities of broadening out the existing obligations in the renewals of licenses or the granting of new licenses to ensure that more schools are connected now that the initial obligations have been met. And then lastly, we talk about what we mean by achieving effective connectivity. So this comes across a number of different key aspects. It looks, for example, at the use of universal service and access funds and the obligations that need to be met. It talks about the need for appropriate implementation of these obligations. And we look also, lastly, I think, and this speaks directly to a number of points that have been made today, at the need for critical media and digital literacy skills to be built in early on in the process, and making sure that people not only have access, but that when they have access, they have safe access and they're able to use the internet safely and remain safe both on and offline. So those are some of the key recommendations that we've made in the report, and that you can find from page 40 onwards. And we map out essentially a way forward to make this a reality, both in South Africa, but I think it's easily replicable in other countries across the continent.
Avni, thank you so much. With that said, we're going to start closing out the session. A reminder that the report's accessible online at internetaccess.africa. And to attendees, we would really welcome your assistance with distribution. So any tweet or any circulation of the report would be most welcomed. Thank you to all of the attendees for joining. And we hope that you found utility both in this panel conversation and equally in the report. To colleagues on the panel, and for those of us who have walked this journey for the last 2 years, a really heartfelt thank you to all of you. Nino and your team at the University of Chicago, thank you so much for leading the research. Avni, thank you for bringing in line with South Africa's constitutional prescripts and for partnering with the Global Human Rights Clinic in the field research that was conducted last year. Ryan, to you and your team at Acacia Economics, thank you for showing us how to approach the same question in different ways, and for all of the work that you put into mapping and proving the economic viability of internet access in schools in South Africa. And then Pakamile, thank you to you and your team at MMA for doing the work on the ground on a daily basis. We wish you only the best with growing and developing the Web Rangers program, and we look forward to being able to continue to support the work that you do. So with that said, thank you to everyone. To everyone else, we wish you a good evening. And yeah, you can follow our social media pages. Our web links are available on the Internet Access site, and we look forward to engaging with all of you again soon. Have a wonderful afternoon.